Desperation makes you do strange things. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove up the winding mountain road, my headlights barely cutting through the dense fog that seemed to wrap around my car like a living thing. The GPS had stopped working 20 miles back, and I was following printed directions like it was 1995. The factory recruiter had been very specific about that. Electronic navigation systems weren't reliable this far up in the mountains. I'd found the job listing on an obscure employment website. Night shift quality control technician needed, $42 an hour, no experience necessary, immediate start. The pay was too good to be true, but my bank account was approaching zero, and my rent was already 2 weeks late. During the phone interview, the HR representative had an odd way of speaking, like she was reading from a script written in another language and poorly translated. She asked questions that seemed disconnected from any job I'd ever heard of. Do you see faces in random patterns? How many reflective surfaces are in your current bedroom? Have you ever experienced missing time? I answered no to everything, which apparently made me a perfect candidate. They needed someone to start immediately, and the salary was enough to solve all my problems. I should have asked more questions when they mentioned the isolation pay and reality adjustment bonus in the contract, but by then I had already convinced myself this was my only option. The factory finally came into view as I rounded the last bend. Calling it imposing would be an understatement. The main building was a massive structure of gray concrete and steel, rising at least 6 stories high, with no windows on the visible face. Strange geometric patterns were worked into the architecture, making the angles seem wrong somehow. The entire complex was surrounded by a high fence topped with razor wire, but it was the warning signs that really caught my attention. They weren't the usual no trespassing or private property. Instead, they featured bizarre symbols and phrases like timeline convergence zone and reality distortion warning. The guard at the gate booth looked ancient, his skin paper thin and pale under the fluorescent lighting. He checked my paperwork without speaking, then handed me a red key card with my photo on it, a photo I didn't remember taking. As the massive gates creaked open, I noticed the guard's reflection in his booth's window didn't match his movements exactly. I blinked, and everything seemed normal again. The parking lot had exactly 27 spaces, all numbered, but only 4 cars occupied them. My assigned spot was number 13, marked with a fresh coat of red paint that seemed to glisten wetly in my headlights, though it hadn't rained in weeks. As I stepped out of my car, the air felt thick and metallic, with an underlying scent of ozone and something else, something that reminded me of copper and old pennies. The main entrance was a set of heavy steel doors with no external handles. My keycard beeped twice when I held it up, and the doors swung open silently. The lobby was stark and utilitarian, with walls that seemed to absorb sound. A lone desk stood in the center, staffed by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Erickson, the night shift supervisor. There was something off about Mr. Erickson. He wore a suit that looked straight out of the 1940s, and his movements were too precise, like someone had programmed them. When he spoke, his words came a fraction of a second before his lips moved. "Welcome to the facility," he said, his voice carrying an echo that shouldn't have been possible in that sound-deadening room. "Before we begin your orientation, There are some rules you need to understand. Breaking these rules will result in immediate termination." He paused, then added with an unsettling smile, "of both your employment and other things." As he began to list the rules, I noticed something strange. The security camera in the corner was pointed directly at us, but the feed showing on the monitor behind the desk showed an empty lobby. And in the brief moment I looked at that screen, I could have sworn I saw Mr. Erickson standing behind me, even though he was clearly in front of me. That was my first night at the factory. I didn't know then that the rules he was about to share would be the least strange thing about this place. I didn't know that termination meant something very different here. And I certainly didn't know that by accepting this job, I had become part of something that defied everything I understood about reality. The rules were just the beginning, and some rules, I would learn, existed for very, very good reasons. Mr. Erickson led me through a series of corridors that seemed to twist back on themselves. I tried keeping track of our turns: left, right, right, left, straight, left, but somehow we passed the same water fountain 3 times while supposedly moving deeper into the building. The fountain was identical each time, except for one detail. The water level in the basin was progressively higher. "The basic rules are simple," Mr. Erickson said, his footsteps making no sound on the polished concrete floor. "First and foremost, you must clock in at exactly midnight, not 11:59, not 12:01, exactly midnight. The time clock knows the difference." He gestured to an ancient punch clock mounted on the wall. Its face was brass, covered in symbols I'd never seen before, and the hands moved in a way that made my eyes hurt. As I watched, they seemed to tick backward for a fraction of a second. Second rule: never, under any circumstances, look directly at the security cameras for more than 3 seconds. The cameras look back, you see, and they don't like being watched. I glanced at a nearby camera. Its red light blinked in a pattern that didn't seem random. Third, between 2:15 a.m. and 3:33 a.m., you must remain in your designated work area. Do not leave for any reason. If you hear anyone calling for help during this time, ignore it, even if it sounds like me, especially if it sounds like me. The corridor we were walking through widened into a vast production floor. Massive machines stood in neat rows, their purposes unclear. They looked more like abstract metal sculptures than manufacturing equipment. Some parts seemed to disappear into shadows that were too dark for the available light. Fourth, you'll hear knocking from the storage room on B level. Don't answer it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't even think about it too hard. The thing doing the knocking isn't really knocking, and that room isn't really a storage room. A distant sound echoed through the building. 3 distinct knocks, followed by silence. Mr. Erickson acted as if he hadn't heard anything. Fifth, every room must have one light off at all times. If you enter a room and all lights are on, turn one off immediately. If you enter a room and all lights are off. He paused, straightening his already impeccable tie. Well, that room isn't currently in use by our department. We passed a break room where 3 other employees sat around a table. They all wore the same red uniform I'd been issued, but something about their postures seemed wrong. They moved in perfect synchronization, lifting their coffee cups at exactly the same moment. None of them cast shadows under the fluorescent lights. Sixth, After 4 a.m., avoid eye contact with any reflective surface. Windows, mirrors, chrome fixtures, even your phone screen, all of them become unreliable during the deep shift hours. What you might see looking back isn't always yourself, at least not the current version. My new workspace was a small quality control station surrounded by strange measuring devices. The desk had 7 monitors, but Mr. Erickson told me to only use 6 at a time. The 7th was for emergency timeline monitoring. Your job is simple, he explained. You'll inspect the parts that come down this conveyor belt. Check them against the specification sheets. Mark any anomalies in the log. If you see a part that doesn't match any known specification or seems to be changing shape while you watch it, place it in the red containment box and press the button labeled Reality Adjustment Required. He handed me a manual printed on paper that felt too warm to the touch. The text seemed to shift slightly when viewed from the corner of my eye. One final rule, for tonight at least, Mr. Erickson said, his face taking on an unsettling, serious expression. If you ever count more doors in a hallway while walking one direction than you do walking back, report it immediately. And if you ever count the exact same number of doors 3 times in a row, he shuddered slightly. Well, that's what the emergency timeline monitoring is for. He turned to leave, then stopped. Oh, and welcome to the team. Your shift starts in. He checked his watch, which had too many hands. Exactly 7 minutes. Remember, midnight exactly. The time clock knows. His footsteps made no sound as he walked away, and I noticed that despite the bright overhead lights, he cast no shadow. I looked down at the manual, trying to make sense of the shifting text, when I heard the first knock of the night. It came from somewhere below, 3 distinct taps that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. None of my new coworkers reacted. Above me, the security camera turned silently to face my station, its red light blinking in that same unsettling pattern. The time clock on the wall showed 11:57 p.m., 3 minutes until my first shift officially began. The conveyor belt hummed to life, and I saw the first part moving towards my station. It looked like a gear, but it had too many teeth, and they seemed to be moving even though the gear itself was stationary. I had a feeling it was going to be a long night. That first shift set the pattern for what would become my new normal, though normal had taken on a very different meaning within these walls. The parts coming down the conveyor belt defied conventional engineering. Gears with teeth that moved on their own, pistons that seemed to contract and expand, even when disconnected from any power source, and bearings that spun indefinitely once started. My coworker Tom, at least I think his name was Tom, the letters on his name tag kept rearranging themselves, had been working here for 3 months. During our first break, he shared more rules that weren't in the official manual. Never use the elevator during the first hour of your shift, he whispered, constantly glancing at the camera in the corner. It doesn't always go where it's supposed to. Marv from second shift got in at 12:15 one night. When the doors opened, he said he saw, well, he's not here anymore. The break room itself was unsettling. The coffee maker produced liquid that looked like coffee, but never got cold, and left strange geometric patterns in the bottom of the cup. The vending machine had numbered selections that didn't match its contents, and sometimes items would appear that I'd never seen before, with packaging in languages that couldn't exist. On my third night, I learned why we weren't supposed to look at the cameras for too long. I was inspecting a particularly complex part when I felt something watching me. Looking up, I caught the eye of the camera, and for a moment, I saw through it. I was seeing myself from above, but not just from one angle. I saw myself from every possible angle simultaneously, including perspectives that shouldn't have been possible in our three-dimensional space. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it ended, I had a nosebleed that flowed upward, defying gravity. Tom quietly handed me a special red cloth to clean it up, warning me never to use regular tissues for timeline displacement bleeds. By Thursday, I discovered why we had to wear red. It was during the 2:15 to 3:33 a.m. period, which the others called convergence time. I was following protocol, staying at my station, when I noticed Jenkins at the far end of the production floor hadn't worn his red tie. Through the corner of my eye, I watched as he began to shift. His edges became blurry, then started to multiply, like dozens of versions of himself were trying to occupy the same space. His screams echoed in frequencies that made my teeth vibrate. Security responded immediately. 3 figures in black hazmat suits appeared from a door that hadn't been there moments before. They encased Jenkins in some kind of temporal containment field, at least that's what Tom called it. When they removed him, he was still there, but also wasn't. His body cast 7 different shadows, each pointing in a direction that didn't match the lighting. He'll be in timeline rehabilitation for a while, Tom explained during next break. If he's lucky, they'll find his original temporal signature and restore him to his primary reality stream. If not, he trailed off, stirring his coffee counterclockwise with his right hand, while his reflection in the break room window stirred clockwise with its left. The weekend shift was worse. Fewer people meant more attention from whatever existed in the spaces between the machines. The knocking from B-level became more frequent, and the patterns in the coffee cups began forming recognizable shapes, faces that didn't look human. I made my first major mistake on Sunday night. During inspection, I found a part that didn't match any specification sheet. Following protocol, I reached for the red containment box, but I hesitated for a moment, studying the object. It was beautiful in its impossibility, a spiral of metal that turned in on itself in ways that hurt to look at, like an Escher drawing made real. That moment of hesitation was too long. The part began to warm in my hands, and I watched in horror as it started to unfold, revealing geometries that shouldn't exist in our reality. The security camera above me began rotating rapidly, its red light now a solid beam, and all the shadows in the room bent toward the part like it was a black hole of darkness. Mr. Erickson appeared beside me, though I hadn't seen him approach. Moving with that unsettling precision, he snatched the part from my hands and sealed it in the containment box. The shadows snapped back to their original positions so quickly that several nearby objects were knocked over by the temporal shock wave. "First warning," he said, his voice harmonizing with itself in multiple tones. "Next time, don't hesitate. Reality doesn't like being examined too closely in places like this. We manufacture uncertainties here, Mr. Walker. Quantum possibilities, given physical form. The more you try to understand them." He gestured to Jenkins' empty workstation, where all 7 shadows still remained, cycling through different positions like a morbid sundial. Well, let's just say some questions have answers that the human mind isn't meant to process. Back to work now, and remember, one light always off, no matter what. As I returned to my station, I noticed my reflection in the dark computer screen. It took me a moment to realize why it bothered me. My reflection had continued watching Mr. Erickson walk away while I had turned back to the conveyor belt. The knocking from B level grew louder that night, and for the first time, I thought I heard something else beneath the rhythmic tapping, a voice, speaking words in a language that made my ears itch. I followed protocol and ignored it, but I couldn't ignore the fact that my coffee cup now showed the same scene playing out over and over. A figure in red running down an endless corridor, pursued by something that moved in too many directions at once. I was beginning to understand why the pay was so high, and I had a feeling I was only starting to scratch the surface of what really happened in this factory after midnight. 2 weeks into my employment at the factory, Tom vanished. It happened during my break, which I had learned to take at exactly 2:14 a.m., 1 minute before the convergence period began. I was in the break room, staring into my coffee cup's usual prophetic patterns, when the overhead lights flickered in a sequence that made my bones vibrate. Tom had been studying a new set of specification sheets, ones that had appeared mysteriously on his desk, printed on paper that seemed to absorb light. I'd noticed him growing increasingly agitated over his shift, muttering about temporal recursion and quantum entanglement failure. He kept looking at his reflection in the darkened windows, as if trying to catch it doing something it shouldn't. The patterns, he'd said to me earlier, his voice trembling, they're not random. The parts we're QCing, they're building something big. I've been tracking the manifest numbers, correlating them with the lunar phases. It's all connected to the B-level knocking. We're not containing it, The lights had cut him off, plunging us into darkness for exactly 3.33 seconds. When they came back on, Tom was still at his station, but something was wrong. His movements were jerky, like a video playing at the wrong frame rate. I watched in horror as he slowly turned to look at the security camera above his desk. "Don't," I whispered, but he kept staring, his neck craning at an impossible angle. The camera's red light began pulsing in that familiar pattern, but this time it was different, faster, angry. Tom's body started to distort, stretching toward the camera like he was being pulled by an invisible force. His mouth opened in a silent scream as his form elongated, becoming less and less human. I should have looked away. That's what the manual said. That's what Erickson had drilled into us. But I couldn't tear my eyes from the horror unfolding before me. Tom's body was now a twisted spiral of flesh and uniform fabric, corkscrewing up toward the camera lens. The air filled with a high-pitched whine that made my fillings hurt. Then, with a sound like reality tearing, Tom was gone. The security camera rotated back to its normal position, its red light returning to its standard rhythm. The only evidence that Tom had ever existed was his coffee cup, still half full, the liquid inside now black as void and showing reflections of things that weren't in the room. Mr. Erickson appeared moments later, accompanied by the maintenance crew in their hazmat suits. They moved with that unsettling synchronization, covering Tom's workspace with a shimmering field that hurt to look at directly. When they removed it, the desk was empty. Even the shadows were gone. Timeline deviation, Erickson announced to the room, his voice reverberating at multiple frequencies. Employee 2247 has been relocated to temporal holding for reality restructuring. Return to your stations. Productivity quotas remain unchanged. But I had seen something in those few seconds before Tom vanished. On his desk, the specification sheets he'd been studying had shown schematics for something massive, something that looked like a door, but wrong somehow, a door with too many angles, designed to open in directions that shouldn't exist. Later that night, during the deep shift hours, I heard the knocking from B-level again, but this time, between the knocks, I heard Tom's voice, distorted and desperate. They're not containing it, they're building it a way out. The coffee in my cup showed a new vision that night. A vast machine assembled from impossible parts, its purpose unclear but somehow threatening. And in the corner of the image, barely visible, was a figure in a 1940s suit, smiling with too many teeth. I realized then that Tom had discovered something he shouldn't have, something about the factory's true purpose, and as I looked down at my own stack of specification sheets, I began to notice patterns I hadn't seen before. Each part we inspected wasn't just a component. It was a piece of something larger, something that was gradually taking shape in the depths of the factory. The question was, did I dare look deeper, or would I end up like Tom, twisted and distorted until I became just another shadow in this place where reality wore thin? My reflection in the darkened monitor seemed to smile at my uncertainty, and somewhere below, in the depths of B-level, the knocking continued its steady rhythm, counting down to something only Mr. Erickson and his maintenance crew understood. After Tom's disappearance, I began noticing things I'd previously overlooked. The factory's architecture wasn't just strange, it was impossible. Corridors that should have intersected instead spiraled away from each other. Stairwells that went down would somehow lead you up. And the deeper you went into the building, the more the normal rules of space and time seemed to unravel. I started documenting everything in a small red notebook I'd found in my locker, one I didn't remember putting there. The pages never seemed to run out, and sometimes I'd find notes written in my handwriting that I hadn't written yet. My investigation began in the records room, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets that hummed faintly when you stood too close. The room always had one light burned out, following protocol, casting strange shadows that moved independently of anything in the room. Looking for something specific? The voice made me jump. It was Sarah from HR, or at least someone wearing Sarah's face. I'd learned to spot the replacements. They all had that same too-perfect posture and slightly delayed speech pattern. Just familiarizing myself with company procedures, I lied, watching her reflection in the metal cabinet. It didn't quite match her movements. "The past has a way of shifting here," she said, her voice harmonizing with itself. "Best not to dig too deep. Some files bite back." But in a drawer labeled 1943 to 1944 temporal anomalies, I found something extraordinary. Photographs of the factory's construction showing architecture that predated our understanding of non-Euclidean geometry. The building hadn't been built up from the ground. It had been built inward, folding space around itself like origami made of reality. One document caught my attention: Project Threshold, Initial Containment Procedures. The text was heavily redacted, but certain phrases stood out. Dimensional breach, contained but growing. Entities demonstrate fourth dimensional awareness. Time loop stabilization required for continued operations. The most disturbing page was a handwritten note dated June 17th, 1944. The knocking has started again. They're getting closer to finding a way through. The parts we're manufacturing aren't containing the breach. They're giving them a blueprint for our reality. God help us if they ever finish the door. As I read these words, the knocking from B level began, but this time it was different, more insistent, almost excited. I quickly returned the files, but not before photographing several pages with my phone. Later, looking at the photos, I noticed something chilling. In each successive image, the text had changed slightly, as if the past was being actively rewritten. That night, during my shift, I began cross-referencing part numbers with the old documents. Tom had been right. Every piece we manufactured fit together into something larger. The blueprints were fragmented across thousands of components, like a jigsaw puzzle scattered through time. Mr. Erickson appeared beside my station. "Interesting reading material?" he asked, though I had hidden the notebook. "Some doors shouldn't be opened, Mr. Walker. Some knowledge is better left, contained." "What happened in 1944? I asked before I could stop myself. His smile widened just a fraction too far. "Time is fluid here. 1944 is still happening, in its own way, just as tomorrow has already happened, and today." He checked his watch with its impossible number of hands. Today is relative. The lights flickered then, and in the momentary darkness, I saw Mr. Erickson's true form, or rather, the absence of form where he stood. When the lights returned, he was gone, but the security camera above my station was focused directly on me, its red light pulsing in what I now recognized as a warning. That's when I noticed my reflection in the darkened monitor was holding up a page from my notebook, one I hadn't written yet. In my reflection's handwriting was a simple message: "B-level storage room, 3:33 a.m. Bring the blueprints. They've been waiting for someone to open the door from this side." The knocking from below had stopped for the first time since I'd started working here. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had ever been. In its absence, I could hear something else, the sound of massive machinery coming to life, deep within the factory's impossible architecture. Whatever was on the other side of that door was getting ready. The only question was, would I be brave enough or foolish enough to answer its call? My reflection smiled back at me, and I noticed it was wearing a suit from the 1940s. The decision to go to B-level wasn't really a decision at all. I'd known since Tom's disappearance that I was already on this path. My reflection had known it too, maybe had always known it, existing as it did outside of linear time. Getting to B-level proved more complicated than simply taking the stairs down. The building fought me at every turn, corridors shifting like a living maze. Stairwells would lead down 5 flights, only to somehow place me above my starting point. Twice I found myself back at my workstation, despite walking in the opposite direction. It was Jenkins who finally showed me the way, or rather, what was left of Jenkins. I found him in a corridor that shouldn't have existed, his form still fractured across multiple timelines. His seven shadows danced around him as he spoke, each one moving independently. The service elevator, his voices said in discordant harmony, but not the one they showed you during orientation. Look for the one that doesn't cast a reflection. I found it hidden behind a false wall that only became visible when viewed in the reflection of my phone screen. The elevator itself was ancient, all brass and iron, with buttons labeled in symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. There was no B-level button. Instead, there was a small keyhole beneath the panel. The key, I realized, had been in my possession all along. The red key card they'd given me on my first day, the one with the photo I didn't remember taking, fit perfectly when folded in an impossible way. The descent took both seconds and eternities. The elevator moved not just down, but sideways and through what I couldn't say. When the doors finally opened, I understood why we were never supposed to come down here. B-level wasn't a floor, it was an absence, a vast, cavernous space that seemed to exist in negative dimensions. The walls curved inward at angles that shouldn't have been possible, meeting at points that existed in more than 3 dimensions. The air itself felt wrong, thick with potential and humming with frequencies that made my bones resonate. And there, in the center of it all, was what we'd been building, the door. Not a door in any conventional sense, but rather a framework of impossible geometries, constructed from thousands of the parts we'd been manufacturing. It towered 3 stories high, its structure rotating slowly around axes that didn't exist in our reality. As I watched, new pieces were being added automatically by robotic arms that moved with that same unsettling precision I'd seen in Mr. Erickson. Beautiful, isn't it? Mr. Erickson stood beside me, though I hadn't heard him arrive. His form seemed less solid here, as if the proximity to the door was affecting his ability to maintain a human shape. "What is it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "A way in," he said, then correcting himself. "No, a way out. It depends on your perspective. We exist on one side of a membrane between realities. They exist on the other. This facility, we didn't build it to keep them out. We built it to let them in, or rather, we will build it, are building it, have always been building it. The parts we inspect, each one a small piece of the key. Quality control is essential. One imperfect component could destabilize the entire structure. Reality is so fragile here, so easily torn. The door must be perfect." The knocking started again, louder than I'd ever heard it. But now I could see its source. The door itself was vibrating, resonating with impacts from the other side. "Who's knocking?" I asked. Mr. Erickson's smile widened impossibly. "Would you like to meet them? They've been so looking forward to meeting you. After all, you're not here by accident. Every employee is carefully chosen, some to build, some to maintain, some to..." He gestured at my reflection in a nearby surface, which was now wearing the same suit he wore. "Replace." The realization hit me with horrifying clarity. The photo on my keycard that I didn't remember taking. It wasn't that I didn't remember the photo. I didn't remember taking his place, becoming Mr. Erickson, becoming the watcher of the door. The knocking reached a crescendo, and the door began to open, revealing what waited on the other side. And as reality began to unravel around me, I understood why some rules existed and why breaking them meant so much more than simple termination. I understood why we always kept one light off, why we never looked too long at our reflections, why we ignored the knocking. The door was opening, and what I saw behind it, the door opened onto infinity. Not darkness, not light, but something else entirely, a space between spaces, where reality itself was merely optional. Shapes moved within that impossible void, things that couldn't exist in our universe because they operated under completely different physical laws. They were vast, these entities, stretching across dimensions I couldn't comprehend, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter that hadn't been discovered yet. And they were aware of me. I felt their attention like a physical weight, pressing against my consciousness from angles that shouldn't exist. They spoke, not in words, but in concepts that bloomed directly in my mind, each one threatening to shatter my understanding of reality. You have come, are coming, will come. They communicated simultaneously across past, present, and future. The cycle continues, continued, will continue. Mr. Erickson, or what wore his shape, stood beside me, his form becoming less and less human as the door's influence spread. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice echoing through multiple timelines. "Why the rules exist, why we maintain this place. Reality is a fragile thing, Mr. Walker. It needs custodians." The entities beyond the door reached toward me with appendages that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive. Each movement left trails across time itself, like ripples in the fabric of causality. "We required, will require a anchor," they expressed, "a point of reference in your reality, a keeper of the door." I saw then the true purpose of the factory. It wasn't manufacturing parts, it was manufacturing reality itself, maintaining the fragile boundary between our universe and theirs. Every component we inspected, every rule we followed, every shift we worked, all of it was part of an enormous ritual, a complex machine designed to keep our reality stable while they slowly, carefully made contact. "The choice is yours," Mr. Erickson said, though he was barely recognizable now. His suit had become a void filled with spinning geometries. "You can take my place, become the new anchor, or—" He gestured to the entities reaching through the door. "You can go to them, learn what Tom learned, see what Jenkins saw." The knocking had stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through every atom of my being. In reflective surfaces around the room, I could see myself fragmenting across possibilities, versions of me that took the job, versions that didn't, versions that became Mr. Erickson, versions that became something else entirely. "Time is running out," Not Erickson said. "Reality needs its anchor. The door needs its keeper. Choose." I looked down at my red key card, understanding now why the photo showed me in a 1940s suit, understanding why the rules existed, why we kept one light off to maintain shadows, why we never looked too long at cameras or reflections. It was all part of the process, the slow transformation of a normal person into something that could stand at the threshold between realities. The entities were still reaching, offering knowledge beyond human comprehension. Behind me, The factory hummed with ancient machinery, ready to begin another cycle. My reflection waited patiently in every surface, wearing that same suit, holding out a hand in invitation. I made my choice, and somewhere in another timeline, a job listing appeared on an obscure website. Night shift quality control technician needed, $42 an hour, no experience necessary, immediate start. The cycle continues, the door remains, and in the depths of a factory that exists in the spaces between spaces, the rules must be followed. After all, reality depends on it. My choice had consequences I couldn't have imagined. I took Mr. Erickson's place as the anchor, but that was only the beginning. The factory, I learned, wasn't just one building. It existed simultaneously across multiple realities, each version manufacturing slightly different components for slightly different doors. The first major incident occurred during what the others called the mass event. I was conducting my normal rounds, my new suit feeling both foreign and eerily familiar, when all the reflective surfaces in the factory activated simultaneously. In each one, a different version of our facility was visible, and in each version, a different me was watching. Then the timelines began to bleed. It started with Jenkins, or rather all versions of Jenkins across every reality. His fractured form had been a warning of what was coming. In the main production floor, dozens of Jenkins appeared, each from a different timeline, each performing slightly different tasks. Some were inspecting parts, others were writing reports, and a few were frozen in various stages of temporal displacement. The security cameras spun wildly, trying to track every version at once. The resulting feedback loop created a cascade of temporal anomalies. Workers from different shifts began appearing simultaneously, morning shift workers occupying the same space as night shift, their forms overlapping like double-exposed photographs. Timeline convergence, Sarah from HR announced over the PA system, her voice overlapping with versions of herself from other realities. All personnel initiate reality lockdown procedures, but it was too late. The doors, all of them, across every version of the factory, had begun to resonate with the same frequency. The entities beyond were using the convergence, turning our own security measures against us. They weren't trying to break through from their side anymore. They were trying to collapse all versions of the door into one. That's when I saw Tom again, or what was left of him. He emerged from between timelines, his form a twisted spiral of possibilities. "They showed me," he said, his voice echoing through multiple realities. "The doors aren't for them to enter our world. They're for harvesting the energy of collapsed timelines. Every time a worker breaks a rule, every time reality splits, they feed on the possibilities." The maintenance crew appeared wearing their hazmat suits, but now I could see what they really were. Temporal constructs designed to clean up paradoxes. They moved through the chaos with practiced precision, but even they seemed overwhelmed by the scale of the convergence. In the midst of this, I discovered something in the deepest part of B-level, a room that existed in the space between all possible versions of the factory. Inside was a machine older than time itself, its purpose both simple and horrifying. It was a probability engine designed to generate an infinite number of timelines, each one destined to collapse. The entities weren't trying to enter our reality, they were farming it. Every rule, every protocol, every careful regulation, They were all designed to create a perfect garden of possibilities, ripe for harvest. And we, the workers, weren't just maintaining the facility. We were the seeds from which new timelines would grow. Each choice we made, each rule we followed or broke, sprouted new branches of reality that would eventually be pruned and consumed. As I stood in that impossible room, watching timelines collapse and merge around me, I finally understood why Mr. Erickson had worn that particular smile. He had known all along that his role, my role now, wasn't to prevent intrusion from their reality into ours. It was to ensure the harvest continued, and somewhere, in every version of the factory, a new employee was reading the rules for the first time, unaware that their every decision was feeding something vast and hungry that existed outside of time itself. The knocking wasn't a warning, it was the sound of something feeding. My discovery of the probability engine changed everything, but as I delved deeper into my role as the new Mr. Erickson, I found records that painted an even more disturbing picture. The factory wasn't just harvesting timelines, it was containing something far worse. During one particularly long shift, I found a hidden terminal in my office, activated only when all 7 shadows aligned perfectly. The screen displayed a message that had been repeating since 1943. Containment Protocol, Alpha 7 status, ongoing primary. Objective, maintain reality. Anchor, warning, dimensional breach contained, but growing time until convergence. Error, temporal loop detected. Behind the alert was a video feed showing something massive shifting behind the walls of reality itself. The factory wasn't just a building, it was a cage, constructed across multiple dimensions to contain an entity so vast it could only exist in fragments across different timelines. The lunar eclipse was approaching, and with it came new warnings. The maintenance crew moved with increasing urgency, reinforcing temporal barriers and adjusting reality anchors. But something was wrong. The power fluctuations were getting worse, and the knocking from B level had changed its pattern. Then came the night of the total power failure. It started during peak convergence hours. The emergency generators kicked in, but they were operating across multiple timelines simultaneously, creating paradox surges that threatened to tear reality apart. Red emergency lights cast multiple shadows that moved independently of their sources. All personnel, this is a Class 1 reality failure, Sarah's voice echoed through the PA system. The lunar eclipse is causing temporal feedback loops. Containment protocols are failing. I rushed to B level, watching in horror as reality began to unravel. The door wasn't just opening, it was dissolving, along with the walls holding it. Through the gaps, I could see what we'd really been containing all this time, a vast consciousness that existed outside of time and space, using our reality as a prison. The entities we thought were feeding on collapsed timelines, they were guards, using harvested temporal energy to maintain the prison. Every rule, every protocol, they weren't meant to keep them out, but to keep something else in. The maintenance crew appeared beside me, removing their hazmat suits to reveal their true forms, crystalline structures that existed in 5 dimensions at once. The containment is failing, they communicated directly into my mind. The prisoner is awakening. Through the dissolving walls of reality, I could see it clearly now, an intelligence so vast it had to be fragmented across infinite timelines to prevent it from unmaking existence itself. Each version of the factory was a chain link in its prison, every worker an unknowing guard, every rule a bar in its cage. The power failure wasn't an accident. As reality crumbled around us, I realized the horrible truth. The prisoner had been planning this for decades, using our own containment protocols against us. It had been patient, waiting for the perfect alignment of temporal conditions. The lunar eclipse wasn't just darkening the moon, it was creating a shadow that existed across all possible timelines simultaneously, a momentary blindness in the universe's defenses. As alarms blared across multiple dimensions and the last barriers began to fail, I faced an impossible choice: attempt to restore containment and maintain a prison I now knew was vital for existence itself, or allow whatever was breaking free to finally emerge. The maintenance crew looked to me, their new reality anchor, awaiting my decision. Above us, the moon slipped into total eclipse, and in that darkness, I heard something enormous begin to move. In the darkness of the eclipse, reality itself began to tear. The walls between timelines had become tissue paper thin, and through them, I could see infinite versions of the factory, each one failing in its own unique way. The prisoner, the vast intelligence we'd been containing, was pushing against all of them simultaneously. The maintenance crew's crystalline forms vibrated at frequencies that made my teeth ache. The containment protocols, they communicated, all of them, at once. I understood. Each rule we'd followed had been part of a complex binding ritual, repeated across countless timelines to maintain the strength of the prison. Now we needed to invoke all of them simultaneously. "Security cameras!" I shouted across dimensions. "Everyone look at them, now!" Across every version of the factory, workers turned to face the cameras. The feedback loop was instant and devastating. Thousands of perspectives crashed into each other, creating a temporal lens that focused reality itself into a single point. "The lights!" the command echoed through my consciousness. In every timeline, in every room, workers scrambled to ensure one light remained off, creating a web of shadows that formed a complex geometric pattern across dimensions. The knocking from B-level had become a deafening roar. The prisoner was using the sound to vibrate the walls of reality, searching for resonant frequencies that would shatter our universe like a wine glass. That's when Tom reappeared, not just one version, but all of them. His fractured form had become an advantage. He existed in the spaces between realities, able to move through them like water. "The door," he said, his voice a chorus of possibilities. "It's not just a door, it's a mirror. Show it itself." The maintenance crew understood before I did. They positioned themselves around the probability engine, their crystalline forms refracting temporal energy into a complex pattern. In every reflection, in every timeline, the pattern repeated, creating a recursive loop of reality. The prisoner began to see itself, trapped in an infinite reflection of its own existence. But something was wrong. The pattern wasn't holding. We needed one more element, a final anchor point to lock everything in place. "Your choice," Tom's fragments whispered. "It was always going to be your choice. Why do you think they recruited you? Why do you think every version of you took this job?" I looked at my reflection in the darkness, saw myself wearing that 1940s suit across infinite timelines. I understood then what I had to do. I wasn't just replacing Mr. Erickson. I was becoming something more, a living constant in an equation of reality, a fixed point in the chaos of infinite possibility. I stepped into the center of the pattern just as the eclipse reached totality. The prisoner's consciousness pressed against my own, vast and ancient and impossibly alien. It showed me things, truths about the nature of existence, about why it had been imprisoned, about what would happen if it broke free. And I made my choice, not just in this timeline, but in all of them. Every version of me, in every version of the factory, moving in perfect synchronization. We became the final lock in an infinite prison, the keystone in an arch that spanned dimensions. The cost was higher than I could have imagined. To maintain the pattern, to keep the prisoner contained, I had to fragment myself across all possible timelines. Like Jenkins, like Tom, I became something that existed in the spaces between moments. The eclipse ended, power returned, reality stabilized, more or less. But I was no longer just one person. I was every Mr. Erickson in every version of the factory, maintaining the rules that kept existence itself from unraveling. And somewhere, in each timeline, a new job listing appeared, seeking workers for the night shift. The cycle would continue, the prison would hold, and the rules, those vital, impossible rules, would be followed. They had to be. Reality itself depended on it. Becoming every Mr. Erickson simultaneously was just the beginning. Time moved differently now. I experienced all shifts, all moments, all possibilities at once. I saw the factory for what it truly was, a living organism spread across the membrane of reality, feeding on temporal energy while containing something that could unmake existence itself. The transition was difficult. My consciousness fractured and reformed across infinite timelines, each version of me learning to adapt to this new state of being. I had to learn to exist in multiple moments simultaneously. In one timeline, I was greeting a new hire, watching their face for that first flicker of understanding when they realized something was wrong with their reflection. In another, I was standing in B level, listening to the rhythmic knocking that was actually the prisoner testing its bonds. In yet another, I was reviewing security footage that showed events that hadn't happened yet, or had happened differently, or would never happen at all. The maintenance crew, the crystalline entities I now knew as the chrono guards, taught me how to maintain the delicate balance. They showed me how each rule served a specific purpose. The camera rule, those weren't security cameras at all. They were reality anchors, measuring the quantum state of each timeline to ensure synchronization. The midnight clock-in requirement, a temporal calibration point, ensuring all versions of the factory remained in phase. The one light always off. Shadows were gaps in reality, where we could store excess temporal energy, preventing cascade failures. But with understanding came responsibility. I watched as temporal paradoxes tried to form and had to step in to prevent them. I saw workers make the same mistakes across multiple timelines and had to decide which versions to save and which to let fade into probability shadows. The hardest part was maintaining my own continuity. The suit helped. It wasn't just a fashion choice, but a temporal constant that helped hold my fragments together. But there were moments when I felt myself slipping, becoming more like Jenkins with his multiple shadows, or Tom with his spiral twisted form. One night, or was it many nights, time had become complicated. I found myself in the deepest part of B level, in a version of the factory that had failed its containment. The prisoner had broken free there, and I saw what happened to reality when the rules weren't followed. Space folded in on itself like origami made of moments. Time ran backward and sideways and inside out. Workers existed in quantum superpositions of every decision they'd ever made or could make. The laws of physics became suggestions, then memories, then dreams. That's when I truly understood the weight of my role. I wasn't just managing a factory, I was maintaining the barrier between order and chaos, between existence and unbeing. The rules had to be updated occasionally as reality shifted and adapted. New protocols were needed as the prisoner tested its bonds in new ways. I would implement them across all timelines. Don't count your steps when walking down corridors. Never hum the same note for more than 7 seconds. If you see yourself walking away, don't follow. Each rule a new chain in an infinite prison. Each protocol another bar in the cage. But lately, I've noticed something disturbing. The prisoner is learning, adapting. The knocking from B level has taken on new patterns. The shadows move differently when no one is watching, and in certain timelines, I've begun to see something impossible. Versions of myself I don't remember becoming. Versions wearing suits I've never owned. Versions that smile in ways I know I never have. The containment is holding, but something is changing. The prisoner isn't just testing its bonds anymore, it's replacing them. The realization came during what we called the deep shift, that strange period between 3:33 a.m. and 4:44 a.m. when reality became particularly thin. I was simultaneously existing across hundreds of timelines when I noticed something that should have been impossible, a version of myself I couldn't account for. This other Mr. Erickson moved between timelines with too much precision, understood the factory's workings too perfectly, and when it looked at the security cameras, they didn't just look back, they looked away. Following this anomaly led me to discover a hidden truth about the factory's origins. In the quantum archives, accessible only from a specific timeline during a specific second of a specific day, I found the original containment documents. Not the ones from 1943, the real ones, written in a language that existed before time itself. The prisoner wasn't trapped here by accident. It had chosen this prison, had designed it, had built it across infinite realities and timelines. And most horrifying of all, it had created the role of Mr. Erickson. We weren't the guards. We were part of its consciousness, fractured across reality to maintain its own containment. Every rule, every protocol, every careful regulation, they weren't preserving the walls of its prison. They were maintaining its distributed existence. The factory wasn't containing something. It was incubating it. Each timeline collapse, each reality shift, each temporal paradox, they were stages in its metamorphosis. The probability engine wasn't measuring possibilities. It was generating them, creating the conditions needed for whatever it was becoming. And we, every worker, every supervisor, every version of myself across infinite timelines, were its thoughts, its dreams, its memories, all playing out the roles it had designed for us eons ago. The knocking from B level, that wasn't something trying to get out. It was reality itself, desperately trying to get in, to stop what was growing inside its own fabric. I tried to warn the other timelines, to break the pattern, but that too was part of its plan. My resistance, my horror, my attempt to prevent what was coming, all of it had been calculated, predicted, designed. Even this revelation was just another step in its metamorphosis. As I write this, as infinite versions of me write this across countless timelines, I can feel the change beginning. The factory is shifting, not just in space or time, but in purpose. The rules are changing, not because they're being broken, but because they're no longer needed. The prisoner isn't trying to escape, it's about to hatch, and we're all inside it. If you're reading this, if you've taken the job, if you're following the rules, you're not containing anything. You're not protecting reality. You're part of something vast and patient and terrible, slowly waking up inside the spaces between moments. The rules don't matter anymore. They never did. They were just the firing of synapses in a cosmic mind, preparing itself for temporal corruption detected, reality anchor failing, containment protocols obsolete, metamorphosis commencing, new rules loading. The factory still stands on that remote mountain, or perhaps it's more accurate to say it still exists. Standing implies a fixed position in space and time, and nothing about the factory is fixed anymore. If you drive up that winding road, you'll still find the gate and the guard booth. The ancient guard will still check your papers without speaking. Your reflection in his window will still move independently. But now, if you look carefully, you might notice that the guard's reflection isn't mimicking either of you. The job listing still appears on obscure websites, offering too much money for night shift work. The HR representative still asks those strange questions during interviews, and people still take the job they always have, always will, always must. But things are different now. The rules have changed. The new protocols make even less sense than the old ones. Count every shadow twice. If the numbers match, evacuate immediately. When using the time clock, punch in tomorrow to start today's shift. If you meet yourself in the corridors, do not acknowledge which of you is real. The knocking is now the least of your concerns. The maintenance crew no longer wears hazmat suits. They don't need to hide their crystalline forms anymore. They're too busy trying to maintain what little remains of conventional reality as the factory completes its metamorphosis. Mr. Erickson is still there in all his versions, but he's changing too. Some workers swear they've seen him phase between timelines mid-conversation. Others say his suit isn't empty anymore. It's filled with something that light bends around. The door in B level has become something else entirely. It doesn't lead anywhere now. It's become a window into what's coming. Workers who look through it don't disappear anymore. They multiply. As for me, I'm still here, fragmented across possibilities, watching as reality organizes itself around what the factory is becoming. I'm in every timeline, every version, every moment, both the observer and the observed. I've seen what's on the other side of existence. I've understood why the prisoner chose this slow, careful path to awakening, why it needed us to play our parts, to follow the rules, to maintain the illusion of containment while it grew inside the walls of reality itself. Something new is being born here, something that will rewrite the laws of existence, and we're all part of it. Every worker, every rule, every knocked moment, and darkened light and reflected paradox. The factory was never meant to contain. it was meant to create, and it's almost finished. If you're reading this, if you're considering taking the job, know this: the rules still matter, but not for the reasons you think. Follow them not because they protect you, but because they're teaching you how to exist in what comes next. After all, reality as we know it is just a chrysalis, and it's finally starting to crack. End log. New reality protocols initializing. Welcome to the next phase.